everybody. Welcome to another podcast from the DJ Anish series, bringing you the best in Southeast Asian history. Today, before we begin, I have a very special song dedication for everybody. Just as it has traumatized the airwaves of my mind in the past few days, I tried to forget it, but you guys reminded me about it, so I thought, hey, why not dedicate this song to you guys? So this song goes out to all the history kids in RV taking this arduous journey of JC history. I dedicate this song to you. It's a special song in my heart, special meaning to the lyrics. I really hope that it reaches out to you as it reached out to me. And I hope that it changes your life in many, many beautiful ways. This song is called Mi Pan. And I'll sing it for you, just to show how much I love you guys. Mi pan, zu zu zu, zu zu zu. Mi pan, yakakush, nyam nyam nyam. Mi pan, zu 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 zu. Well, what a wonderful performance. I know, come your encores. We will not have any more encores. If your eardrums are still left intact and you haven't vomited out your entire guts and every single food that you've eaten in your life by now, and you're still here, hey, welcome to this podcast. Today we'll be looking at something equally as traumatic as the singing of my voice and the rendition of the song that I gave you just now. Remember, it's the thought that counts. It came from the heart. Just try to ignore the tone and everything else, and just think of the spirit of where it came from. But okay, going back to focus, Shane, focus. Okay, going back to today's podcast, it's something equally as traumatic for the region back then. We're looking at Konfrontasi, something that we've already delved into quite a bit, whether it was with the content or looking at certain sources. But the nature of the sources that we looked at in the past was more text-based, looking at certain speeches and things like that. So today I thought that while keeping the focus on evaluation, thought I could introduce to you guys some non-textual sources, in particular 3 political cartoons. And I want to use these political cartoons to really continue to focus our skills and our efforts on evaluation related matters. So that will be our focus for today's podcast. So if you are ready and if you are good and you are still kind of can hear me after that wonderful intro, let's journey on into this. Now, going into the syllabus document once again, I just want us to focus on with this topic. We are looking at the topic of interstate conflict or interstate tensions. We are looking at avenues of conflict as well as potential for cooperation. So we are looking at the causes as well as the consequences of interstate conflict within Southeast Asia. Right now we are dealing with Konfrontasi. Most directly, it is a conflict between Indonesia and the new nation of Malaysia. But I mean, broadly speaking, there are other parties involved as well, like Singapore, like Britain, to some extent the Commonwealth nations like Australia and New Zealand as well, especially in the active warfare part in the Borneo states. So it is a conflict that lasts not for a very long period of time, about 2 years plus, but it is as intense as it gets. There's a physical element to it, there's a military element to it, there's a security element to it, there's a sovereignty element to it, and so on. So you can see that this conflict is actually quite complex, and that's something that I want you to keep at the back of your mind as you continue to uncover and investigate more on this conflict. So on the question focus, the hypothesis focus, remember that we are dealing with question 1A, so we're looking at compare and contrast sources. The hypothesis focus for these questions would usually revolve around one of these two things, either on issues to do with responsibility, who's more to blame for causing the conflict or things like that, or the nature of the conflict, like what was this conflict really about. So if you refer to the last SVQ, the 2 textual sources that I gave you, that one, right, the hypothesis focus there, the consistency of Indonesian policy, I think that one is slightly more to do towards the nature type of question focus. However, today as we go into the cartoon sources, each of them I've given the same hypothesis, and this same hypothesis is going to be dealing with more responsibility related matters. But remember that our focus isn't so much on inference right now, it's about evaluation. So later on I'll take you through, but our focus is going to be more about unpacking the contextual understanding of the sources, looking at provenance details and how it can help us to unpack our contextual understanding of the sources. So just a final recap before we go into the sources itself. Remember that with regards to the presentation of your arguments, the sequence of your inference and your contextual understanding paragraphs, seeing sources in context, those evaluation paragraphs, it's up to you how you want to arrange them. Is a matter of your style, but just make sure that those components are there. Okay. When you go into seeing the sources in context, just make sure that you use the provenance details. Your CK, whatever you bring in, is going to be tied to those provenance details that you identify, that you analyze. Okay, so now today I will be giving you 3 sources. All of them are cartoon sources. J14, if you're listening on to this, actually you've already dealt with this in last week's tutorial because you guys are faster a bit. So yeah, we can actually use this podcast as a recap. But for the rest of the classes, this is new to you, so you can take a bit more time to look at it. Right now, what I would need you to do is probably to pause this podcast, go and access the document that contains these 3 cartoon sources, and perhaps try them out for yourself first. These 3 sources, you are meant to look at them individually, so they don't really connect to one another. There's no compare and contrast requirement over here. Remember, our focus today is on how to evaluate. So each of these sources, they exist in themselves, and you can just look at them for themselves, look at the inference that they have, and then quickly move on to try to explain why the sources may be portrayed in this manner, looking at the sources in context to help explain that. Okay, so at this stage, I would encourage you guys to pause the podcast first, and then after that, go and analyze these sources for yourself, try it as best as possible, and then later on you can resume this podcast and hear me out for some of the things that I will point out with regards to evaluation. So just a recap, each of these sources can be dealt with individually. There is the hypothesis at the top, and then you can try and inference on that first with regards to those individual sources, and then after that go into trying to explain why the source in context would present it this manner. Okay, so pause here, and then later on you can resume. Okay, if you have already looked at the sources, I mean, you can resume it, and if you're hearing my voice, it means that you want to continue. Yeah, so I'll just quickly scan through these 3 sources. I hope that you've got a chance to interpret them and to look at them in greater detail, and I hope that you have some responses for yourself as well, so that you can either check with whatever I'm going to say, or maybe whatever I'm going to say can help to supplement whatever you currently have. Let's deal with the first source first. Now, remember that for evaluation, okay, let's do a simple recap on evaluation first. Now, for evaluation for part 1A questions, when you look at the sources in context, remember that you are essentially trying to ask yourselves, why did the sources or the source portray the issue in this manner? Why did they present this message? Why did they present certain elements to this source? Why did they highlight certain things? Why did they structure this message? Why? A lot of the questions wow, sorry, too much coffee. A lot of the questions have to do with why. So keep asking yourself the question why from the provenance point of view, from the authorship point of view. So you can see that the evaluation focus here is very different from 1B. 1B, you are dealing with other aspects like reliability and usefulness and all that. We're not really dealing with that here. We're just seeking to understand why that would be this inference, and why would the author, portray in such a manner. So, taking a look at this cartoon source over here, remember that let's start out with the yellow boxes first. When we do an inference, remember there are two conditions that you need to fulfill. The first condition is that whatever inference that you surface, whatever inference that you derive from the source, make sure that it is tied to the focus in the hypothesis. So it can't be any inference on Earth. It has to be an inference from the source material, and it is tied to the question focus. So in this case, the question focus, as I mentioned earlier, is on responsibility. So when we look into this source for its inference, we are going to be looking for items and messages that are more related to the question focus on responsibility. So in this case over here, I think the portrayal is quite straightforward, and I think it's quite obvious based on the portrayals of this source where does responsibility lie. So I think you know that, but let's go through it anyway. The second yellow box over here. So definitely, in terms of responsibility, there's a portrayal of a high degree of responsibility. So that's my inference from the source. High degree of responsibility on the part of Indonesia, as represented by Sukarno. Oh, this is another point I would like to highlight. That's why you need to know how the leaders look like. So if you get a political cartoon and you see like a caricature of a leader, like you would know who those leaders are, and you can make more use of the source. So important to stare at the faces of the leaders and make sure that they are just imprinted and ingrained in your brain. Like I want you to dream of them, that kind of one. Like like you stare at this picture and you dream of Sukarno like scolding you like over something or whatever. I want that kind of level ones. Okay, so just go and stare at all the South. Okay, your homework today, just go and stare at all the Southeast Asian leaders. Just stare at their faces. Your parents ask you what you're doing, just say, this one my teacher asked me to do, and I just need to stare at their faces. Okay, so just go and like just stare at them, right? And it will definitely help you in reading political cartoons. So high degree of responsibility, and I want to give some explanation from the source material. So I said, due to the high degree of aggression, I think you can see the aggression over here, high degree of aggression and belligerence shown. So belligerence is just another way to express aggression. Compounded by the portrayal of Tengku, who is the figure on the left, portrayal of Tengku being in a state of surprise or a state of shock, or just on the verge of tears. Okay, don't say that lah, but you get the idea. Which suggests their degree of provocation was low or absent. They are over here meaning Malaysia. So that might transfer a bit more agency of action and responsibility of action onto Indonesia, because clearly it's a very one-sided portrayal over here where Sukarno is just battling down on Tengku, and that does suggest a very high degree of responsibility on the Indonesia side, as represented by Sukarno. So this could be a very simple inference that you come up from this source. We just do a check. Does this address the question focus on responsibility? Well, I think it does. So that inference can pass, and we can move on to evaluation. Now, for the evaluation, we go to the blue boxes. For the evaluation, the question shifts to why would the cartoonist be portraying the image as such. So looking at the message, looking at the purpose, looking at the author in the context to understand why the image was constructed this way, what was the agenda, and how did the agenda inform the construction of this image. So generally speaking, now I need to go into the provenance, and from this provenance, actually, you can see I can pick out at least 5 items to unpack in order to understand this source in context. Now, usually when we explain a source in context, when we evaluate a source in this way, when we explain why would the source be portraying it as such, we aren't going to use like of these five things, right? We aren't going to use just one thing. Usually we are going to use two or more things in conjunction with one another in order to explain the portrayals in the source, to evaluate the source in context. So we can go through one by one, but keep in mind that probably they will need to be used in conjunction with one another. So the authorship over here the author is is a political cartoon from a Dutch newspaper. So looking at that provenance and what kind of significance it has for the portrayal over here, the title Sukarno intimidating Tengku, so that's very straightforward and is a very not a roundabout way in explicitly describing to you what has happened. So even if you are confused by um, the images coming from the cartoon itself, the title is there to really focus and sharpen your mind on what the cartoonist is trying to portray. So the general audience would definitely get what this is all about with this cartoon. The purpose, same thing, quite tied to the authorship. The medium is a newspaper, is public, and what kind of effect does that have? And the date, lastly, is within our conflict time frame of the confrontasi period. So same thing also. How does that affect the portrayals seen in the source over here? So these are the general kind of provenance details that you would normally pick up. But of course, these are the general things. Now we need to ask perhaps more specific questions in order to help us to understand the portrayals seen in this source. So, given that I have these five things, I now need to ask myself more questions related to these five things. And for that, we have the pink box over here. So, with regards to the fact that this is a political cartoon published in a Dutch newspaper, of course, I don't know anything too much about the Dutch newspaper, but one of the first questions I want to ask myself, and one of the first things I want to ascertain, is to bring up the Dutch-Indonesian relationship. And the Dutch-Indonesian relationship in this point in time. So you see, I need to use things in conjunction, looking at the medium, the author, and the date. I want to see all these three things together to piece together a better explanation as to why the images might be constructed in this way. So I want to know the context of the relationship between the Dutch and the Indonesians. Now, from my contextual knowledge, I know that the Dutch-Indonesian relationship is not a good one. We know from their decolonization experience, it was very, very messy. It was very, very chaotic. We know at this point in time, Indonesia is still fighting the Dutch for certain territories. Most recently to 1964 is West Irian. So we know that the relationship is still rocky. Like even though Indonesia is independent now, but we know that the relationship is still rocky, and it comes from both sides. The Indonesians would have like baggage, right, with the Dutch, and there's some ill feeling over there. The Dutch definitely has a lot of ill feeling at this point in time because of the way they were forced out of Indonesia and how messy it was, and to some extent how humiliating it was for the Dutch and so on and so forth. So this, and if I relate it to a Dutch newspaper, I have to assume that this is something representative of public opinion of the Dutch towards the Indonesians at that point in time. So the complications and the animosity within their relationship, I think, would definitely factor into why the sense of responsibility is so squarely put on Sukarno and so squarely put on on Indonesia, like at this point in time. So just from that alone, understanding the context of the Indonesian-Dutch relationship, I can already start to understand why the source is drawn and portrayed in this way. The context of Feb 1964, besides what I said about the earlier things about the relationship back then, but 1964 is also within the conflict time frame. So you see dates, right, can be used for different angles and different aspects of it. Just now with 64, I use it in reference to decolonization, and I use it in reference to the New York Agreement with West Irian. But now 1964, I'm using it slightly in a different way. I'm looking at 1964 as within the Konfrontasi time frame. So naturally, the tensions will be really high at this point in time, and naturally at this point in time, we know that Indonesia is already engaging in a lot of aggressive action. And so this may be actually a reflection of what is coming out of the region at that point in time, with a lot of Indonesian aggression against Malaysia. So, on that manner, I think that the date has many ways for you to use it. The date in the provenance itself might not be tied to just one thing, but it might be tied to many things, and so you can situate it within different contexts. The third thing to consider, the nature of political cartoon and caricatures. So I think you might notice by now, but political cartoons and caricatures, usually they are exaggerations of the truth. Usually they're trying to illustrate their point in a very exaggerated manner, because there are usually no text involved in drawings. So the only way to convey your message is to draw the image or draw your message in a very exaggerated manner, so that everyone will know what you're talking about, even if you don't use words. It's like acting. Like actors, usually they exaggerate emotions because they want to convey that sense of emotion to the audience, just by them looking at the screen. So in the same way, the very high degree of responsibility shown on Indonesia over here might be as a consequence of the nature of a political cartoon source, or the nature of a caricature. So there are political motives to this, and the medium and the nature of it is drawn would definitely exaggerate and exemplify the guilty party over here. And the last thing over here, the agenda of the illustration as indicated by the title, as I mentioned just now, Sukarno intimidating Tengku. So kind of like if that is the purpose of this drawing, then you're naturally going to assume that the drawing would reflect this in the starkest manner possible. So sometimes looking at the title will give you an understanding as to what the author's purpose was, and that could inform why there was a high degree of responsibility shown in this source as well. So you see, going with the blue box and the pink box, we can see that the general details are in the blue box: author, title, purpose, medium, date. All these things I think can be used in most sources. But the pink boxes, the pink box, the questions you see over there are going to be more specific to the source itself. So the pink box kind of like emerges from the blue box, the 5 points there, but the pink box is very, very tied specifically to the source in question. So the questions you're asking over there, the things you're trying to uncover, is really quite related to the source itself. Okay. So kind of like going through the other two sources, we're going to repeat the process, and we're really going to try to also keep our focus on evaluation. So over here, same hypothesis, responsibility issues. The inference over here that I have, portrayal of a low degree of responsibility on the part of Indonesia. Remember that's my question focus. Due to the high degree of aggression and belligerence attributed to the colonial power as seen by the central image over there, which in this sense might be inferred to as the British. Main portrayal centers on them, the British, imposing and forcing their way to form Malaysia, maybe even illegitimately shown, given the level of aggression and imposition shown or implied within the source. You can even bring in the left like figures, the like the guy and the little girl. There are shocked faces and all that kind of stuff. So I don't know, I think we've been through this a bit in J14 about the man on the right. I can't really see clearly what his posture means. Yeah, so I probably wouldn't comment on that. And that's one thing about cartoon sources. If these are side distractions and they don't really affect the main message, and you can't really tell what is it about, perhaps it's the best idea not to even engage with it and just focus on the main images seen in the source. So, same thing over here. Now that we have that inference showing that low degree of responsibility on Indonesia's part, because here it shows that the area of responsibility really lies more with the colonial power. Let's go into the same thing. So from the provenance, the blue box you can see over there, I can see about four things, four big things. But again, the pink box shows you the more specific questions that you can ask um, in order to better see this source in context and to explain the portrayal. So over here, the date of the context is 22nd December 1962. So this is quite different from the first source that you saw. Situating this source, we can see that it is before the formation of Malaysia. So Malaysia was formed 16 September 1963. So this is about a year or so before the nation is formalized and is established. But more importantly, I want to try to situate this date within something closer to the context and something closer to what the source is portraying. So clearly, we look at the source and we see that over here it's about a situation in Borneo, and that concerns Sabah and Sarawak. And we are looking at the colonial power having some sort of forceful approach towards Borneo, Sabah, Sarawak. So I want to try to link 22nd December 1962 to that portrayal from this cartoon source. And if I put two and two together, then I get four. Ha, I can do math. Hashtag math whiz. No, right. If I put two and two together, I can see that actually this portrayal is talking about the referendum processes, the process of getting the will of the people in Sabah and Sarawak, whether or not they want to join Malaysia. So clearly there are quite big insinuations here that the process is not sound, the process is not legitimate, the process is very um, interfered on by external powers like the British. There's a lot of impositions, there's a lot of bullying, maybe, a lot of that kind of stuff. So I think the date, 22nd December 1962, would fall better with that context. And you can see that why I chose that better context is because of what I saw in the source. So I'm trying to piece everything together to see how to best explain this source in context. So once again, the date is a very tricky thing. There are many things that you can connect the date to, but what is the best thing that you can connect the date to with reference to what the source is portraying? So that's a decision that you need to make, and it's a decision that will be more accurate the more familiar you are with the timeline. Same thing, the nature of a political cartoon, what effect does that have? In this case, on the portrayal of the colonial power and a high degree of responsibility seen over there. And the third thing, the agenda of the newspaper publication and its left-wing nationalist status. So this source is from Indonesia, and it is a newspaper article, left-wing nationalist newspaper. Now, you may not know what left-wing means in this context, and that's okay. But you would surely have a better idea of what nationalist means. And when you have a nationalist newspaper, what are the tendencies that it has? What are the inclinations that it has? How would it view its own nation versus how would it view external powers? Definitely, I think in the context and in this case, seeing that it's a nationalist newspaper, it's going to set up the country of Indonesia, its own country, in a kind of it has morality or the moral high ground. It is the victim or the subject of abuse from external interference. So it's really going to try to paint a very negative image of the external powers interfering in the region. given the context of its medium and the purpose of a nationalist newspaper. In this context, again, 1962, and in this time frame and all that, left wing usually means you're referring to the socialists and you're referring to the communists. And we all know that in this context, the socialists and the communists and all that, they are very adverse to the idea of external interference. They are very adverse to the idea of superpower interference. They are very adverse to the idea of Western interference. They are just very guarded in that sense of their sovereignty and their independence, and they don't want this kind of meddling. So that might help you to understand the portrayal seen very squarely against the colonial power in this source. So the last source I chose for you guys, Chinese source. I thought it would be a good one for you because you guys are from a SEP school. Yeah, I actually had to kind of like call up a senior and ask her to translate this whole thing for me in case I got anything wrong. Okay, so in going to this source, the inference, okay, the hypothesis is the same. The inference, we are looking at a high degree of responsibility on the part of Indonesia due to the strong portrayal of provocative agency on the part of Sukarno. We can see him holding the scissors, where there is a strong showing of political intent at Indonesian expansionism. You see, it's almost like a land grab over here. And the caption in Chinese says, after West Irian, we're looking at Malaya. So that's the kind of message that is really about Indonesian sphere of influence, its expansionism tendencies, and things like that. Going into the provenance, same thing. We extract out 5 details, big details we can see from here. And from these 5 details, we can ask more specific questions. So this one, political cartoon published by the Singapore Ministry of Culture. So what we want to understand is Singapore's position in the conflict. This is 1964, so Konfrontasi is already on, and we are looking to understand how does this source, being situated within the conflict time frame, how does it affect the portrayals seen over here? Don't forget that Singapore is on it's kind of a victim of sorts of Konfrontasi. It is facing the brunt of Indonesian aggression, just as Malaysia is. So how does that affect the portrayals seen in this source? Date context, Jan-Feb 1964. So again, this is when Konfrontasi has already begun. Malaysia has already been formed. This is just kind of like the initial phases where the conflict is militarizing itself and is entering a more dangerous security phase to it. So, how does that affect the portrayals seen over here? The nature of a political cartoon, so that one is something you can take from the earlier sources as well. And the last one, agenda of the Singapore Ministry. What kind of public messaging could they be aiming towards with releasing a cartoon like this in an official state publication? That is a very high level visibility and a very political message that is being sent out as well. Why would they do something like this? What's the context that informs us of their agenda and purpose over here? So yeah, you can see that as I went through these 3 sources, my boxes are quite consistent. My process is quite consistent. You can try this out for yourself in terms of the thinking process towards the construction of your evaluations. So I hope that this gave you some clarity or supplemented what you already have, and we can get a better understanding of evaluation. And then next time round, we'll deal with other sources, and we'll try to build on what we've learned today as well as the previous tutorials. So that's what I have for today. Key learning point, 2 things. Number 1, remember to stare at Southeast Asian leaders and their faces and just memorize them and have them imprinted on your head. And the second big point from today's podcast is Mi Pan Zu 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 Zu. Mipan Yakakus. Nyam nyam nyam. DJ Anesh out.